And now we're going to continue with the expression, the synthetic expression. Okay. This week we'll try not to finish narrow escape and diastrate. I'll explain what it means. And starting next week, we're going to go to biology, application, models, deconvolutions, how we use polymer models to calculate looping time, which is important for the nucleus organization, chromatin dynamics, double-strand DNA break. Also, we'll continue with aggregation. How you do aggregation with a finite number of particles. This is important for yeast organization, where you have the end of the chromosome, which are called the telomere. You have 32 of them, and they can form clusters. And the clusters, you are interested in how many clusters do you have, and why do you have clusters, and how many particles per clusters, and what's the probability that you find two particles in the same cluster. Again, the novelty here is because you have 32 particles. You have finite numbers of particles. All right, so this is going to be, after this class, this is going to be the second part of the class, which is applications. All right, so but today, this is also a very important part for the application, because this is a coarse graining of rare event. How you quantify rare event? By the narrow escape problem. So narrow escape, or sometimes we call it stochastic narrow escape. So this is what we started last week, and we said the question is, if we have a domain, if you have a particle starting at position x, you ask how long it takes for this particle to find for the first time, to hit for the first time this part here and to find a small hole. This is the goal of the lecture of today, which is how long it takes to find this small hole. Right? So we can start with a full stochastic equations, B of x sigma x w dot. This is a deterministic drift. This is the noise part. You can put the deterministic drift to 0, and then you have purely diffusion. Sometimes you can have what's called degenerated diffusion, and this is very tough. When you have, let's say, for example, diffusion in only one direction. This leads to a completely different type of problem. This is called, this leads in partial differential equation to hypoelliptic operator. And I'm not going to enter into this, because then the problem of escape, when you have noise in only one direction, which can happen if you have devices such as a radio or a receiver, you can have only noise in one direction. You want to make sure that noise propagates enough in the system to allow you, for example, to escape. You know, if you want to escape here and you have noise in only this direction, there is no way that you can go that direction. So this is the idea of all this condition on the hypoelliptic operator, which I'm not going to go into. But so it happened that you have this. This is, for example, if you think about the Langevin equation, when you write it in 2D, you have noise in only one variable, not in the other one.
Well, here is also 2D, the example.
This is 2D, and we have noise in two directions. So sigma x here is going to be, the eigenvalues are never going to be 0.
Okay.
So, right, so this is close to identity, or the determinant of this is never 0. Right? So, for example, I can give you two open questions for those of you who are interested. The first open question that, so let me state first the problem, and I'll give you two open questions. Two open questions means possible papers, because nobody knows what to solve, including me. I mean, we have to think about it. So let's first formulate the question. If you have pure Brownian motion, right? So let's say you have square x dot equals square root of 2d w dot. This is Brownian motion. This is diffusion coefficient, which can be 1 if you're a mathematician. It's unimportant as long as it is not 0 and positive. Then, how you formulate the time? So we said that the first time tau, depending on x, that your particle, which is satisfy this stochastic equation, the first time that you will hit the absorbing part, which is in here, this is the absorbing boundary, and this is called the reflecting boundary, where at each time the particle hits this, it is reflected. So the first time that you hit this condition, that at time 0, you started at position x. And what you are interested in is you start in here, you look at one example, it arrives here, you average over all the realization, which means the expectation of tau of x. And what is interesting is that u of x, here, which is tau of x, satisfy the equation d Laplacian u. We have seen this 3 or 4 classes ago. This is called the Dynkin equation that were formulated in 1961. D Laplacian u equal -1 for all x in the domain omega, and u of x equals 0 for x in the omega, and du dn equals 0 for x on the reflecting part. This is absorption, and this is reflection. Okay, and so it's hopeless to think that we can have an asymptotic here expansion unless epsilon, the size of the domain, which is absorbing divided by the total boundary. So you take this region here, you divide by the entire boundary length or surface, depends where you are. So if this is very small, let's say 10%, we expect that we can have an expansion for this as epsilon is small. And actually, as we said last week, when epsilon goes to 0, the time should go to infinity, because the time, and the question is how it goes to infinity. This is exactly what we would like to solve. So how it blows up to infinity, this is the goal. And we said we wanted to explore more about how the solution looks like. We said that if you start exactly here on the boundary or in the small neighborhood of this, so let me make here a bigger absorbing boundary. I can even put some color. I like red. So we'll do it in red. So we have here the absorbing boundary. And here you have a neighborhood, where if you start in this neighborhood, the time when epsilon goes to 0, and the neighborhood depends on epsilon, the time will not go to infinity because you can always escape very quickly. So this is a neighborhood, which is called a boundary layer. So we have here what is called the boundary layer, where the solution should go basically from 0, when you start exactly at the boundary, you are out in 0 time, to a solution that is inside that should go to infinity when epsilon goes to 0. Right? So this is the type of asymptotics or behavior that we are looking for. We say that if you start outside, wherever you start, it doesn't matter. It's a constant C epsilon that we have to find. Unless we start in this boundary layer, so this is x in omega minus boundary layer, or if you start in the boundary layer, well, now it should be a function of x. And again, to be determined. This is our goal of the next 20 minutes in dimension 2. and we will do it in dimension 3, and we will look at 2 holes, and then we will look at what happened when this is singular. That is, for example, you have a cusp. It's very hard for a Brownian particle to escape. Why? It's not that we are a bit vicious. Why it came out that you have to look at this. This was a model for crowding. You have a cell crowded with obstacles. What is important are the big obstacles. The small one is unimportant. And if you want to calculate how long it takes to go beyond in between those obstacles, they have to go through this funnel. And so if you now go to a regular, you put the obstacle on the grid, like this. So now you imagine that you have a square lattice grid. And as the radius A, and let's call it L, so A plus A is 2A, has to be less than L. But when 2A converges to L, you end up here with a small domain to escape. And then the question is, of course, how do you escape when you are in a domain where you escape at the end of a funnel? So this is different from this, where the domain is smooth. Here it will be like, suppose you have to escape on something with a cusp, which is really a singularity in the domain. So you should expect that the time to escape from here or to escape from there, although this and this can have the same lengths, it's going to be different. And we're going to see how it is different. And this is how we develop new type of asymptotic methods to solve the Laplacian type equation. And I want to explain this. But before, I promised 2 open questions. So let me give them to you. The first open question is, what is the mean first passage time for a Langevin particle? So what is a Langevin particle? So open questions. Now, this, what we're going to do is for this. Now suppose you have a Langevin particle. Wait, I have to maneuver this because now I'm getting hot. So 1 second. Okay. So what is the Langevin equation? The Langevin equation is, let's say, x dot plus second derivative plus gamma x dot equals, so let's say 2 gamma epsilon w dot. Epsilon is kT, gamma is the viscosity, the friction. In the Smolokhovsky limit, what is the Smolokhovsky limit? Smolokhovsky limit is gamma large, and then you can get rid of this term, this is well known, and then you get this divided by gamma, so you get 2 epsilon divided by gamma, which is exactly the diffusion coefficient. I'm not going to the Smolokhovsky limit. You have this equation. What is the mean first? What is the escape time? What is the narrow escape for this? I don't know. Why? Why it's more complicated? Because now you don't have, if you are in, this is x in dimension 2, because you have velocity, you have to keep track of this position and the velocity, which means that you are in dimension 4. Because this equation is really x dot equals v and v dot, which is minus gamma v plus 2 gamma epsilon w dot, right? So now we are back to a system of first order equation, noise in one variable, not in the other one. And so now we have to see what is the associated domain. This is in x. Now we have to see what happened for v. And then we need to give a proper boundary condition. in here. That is, the particle is escape when x equals 0, and v has to point out this direction. So there is here a formulation. I mean, it's not, I don't want to do that now, but we need to find out, first of all, the Fokker-Planck equation for this, which they are going to be a derivative in v and in x. We need to find the proper boundary condition for x and v, and then formulate. So we'll have probability. It's going to be the joint probability for x, v, and t, and then we need to find out what's going to be the mean first passage time. Probably we have to take the marginal of the whole velocity. We need to formulate this question correctly, which should take more than 5 minutes, and then see what's going to be the deviation. Obviously, in the Smolchowski limit, when gamma is large, we should recover what we're going to calculate today. But in general, there are going to be a perturbation. My question is, what is this perturbation? I don't know. Is this problem important? Maybe, maybe not.
Epsilon is not the same as the epsilon, the small parameter, presumably.
No, I'm sorry. No.
Call it D or something.
Yes. So this should be called, yes, absolutely. This is delta, right? Epsilon here, we don't care about, so this is the same question than here, where we have this delta, and I want to know, so here we are going to have this expansion, and what I predict is that for the mean first passage time, for this problem, which we call, let's say mean first passage time when we don't care about v, because we have to do some kind of averaging here, as a function of delta, should look like what we're going to get here, the C delta, plus probably there will be a perturbation in, I don't know exactly if it's 1 over gamma, or 1 over gamma with some power. I don't know what is the power here. Let's call it C1 delta. There's going to be an expansion. I don't know what's going to be the power here. But, I mean, what is exactly this? This would be interesting. Okay, so this is one thing. And now something that is useful in simulation is, I would like to, so this is open question Q number 1. Now let's ask question number 2. Again, we came out in the last 5-10 years. I had this question in the back of my mind because they pop up in some applications, and especially the question number 2, is what happened when we have a random walk? That is, if you think about, this is the continuous case. Now, in general, when you do your escape problem, you're on the computer, and the computer you're at a scale delta t. And so, what is the approximation? This is really the random walk, xt plus delta t equals xt plus square root of 2d delta t here, and then you have your Gaussian variable at each step. It's we are introducing here a new time scale, a new delta t, which is the resolution of your simulation. Now, in the limit delta t goes to 0, this random walk converges to the continuous random walk in some sense. And so the question is that now the mean first passage time is a function of delta t. If you look at, calculate delta t here for a given, calculate the mean escape time for a given delta t. Of course, if delta t is very small, we expect, this is how you do your simulation, that it converges to this. Now, I don't know what is exactly the term, that is, it should be C delta plus something. Now, this I don't know what it is. Is it in square root delta, whatever?
Yes, it is.
What?
Yes, it is.
Square root delta? Yeah, so it should be square root delta. And what is exactly the expansion here? I don't know.
Depends on the geometry.
Okay, so that would be interesting to know exactly what happened. so let's call it F or C1 delta plus whatever. This would be interesting to see what exactly we have. Yeah, okay. Let's assume here we have not a cusp, because if we have a cusp, then it is very delicate. Because then when you enter into the cusp, the delta t, so we did a lot of simulation in the past, playing on this delta t, depending when you are. If you want to accelerate a simulation, you take, for example, delta t small when you enter in this region, and delta t large, so you make some type of hybrid simulation, so it goes very fast here because you don't care about exploring this space. And you refine it when you are close to the small hole. Okay, so this is something that would be that would interest us. I
Did you
didn't
do anything more clever than just making the time step smaller?
I'm sorry.
Did you do anything apart from just making the time step smaller?
It's adaptative depending on the geometry.
Yeah, but I mean, you can, because the problem is that your path can go out and then in again in your time step.
In a lot of what? Of this region?
Yes, exactly. I mean, out of the whole domain.
You mean what do you mean? If you have here reflecting boundary condition?
The time stepping can be exact.
Yeah.
Statistically exact, meaning that you start from here and you end here, and that's the correct sample. Okay. The
Yeah.
problem is that your path in between can hit the boundary and come back in again.
Yeah. Okay. We haven't.
So that's the problem.
Okay.
That's why you have square root delta t convergence.
Okay.
Okay. So the way to solve that is to have a correction, a conditional probability that you have hit the boundary, given your starting point and your ending point.
So you're saying that this term here will get mostly the boundary into this term?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, this will be interesting, because then what happens if you have a strange, I mean, you need to have
Based on
some,
the geometry.
okay,
It's hard to calculate,
but you have an expression? This would be interesting, actually.
so if the boundary is
Flat?
flat,
Yeah.
then you can get the expression, and that's usually good enough to make the convergence, improve the convergence from square root delta t to something like delta t.
Okay.
But
All
if the boundary has a funny shape, then it's very difficult to calculate.
I see. Look, even if we have something flat, it will be already interesting. If we have like a round shape, this also be interesting. And then, of course, if you're in the biology, it's, we have all kind of strange. But already, with this kind of question, that's interesting. Okay. All right. So how do we solve this problem? So I told you last week that there are two groups, two approaches. One from my colleague in University of British Columbia that has developed match asymptotics, and us that have developed Green's function. I will show you Green's function. And match asymptotics, it's usually in the paper of the group of Michael Ward.
Dan Coombs is coming next week.
And Dan is coming. So Dan can,
Explain a little bit.
yeah, if people are interested. Yeah, this is what I've heard. It's coming next week. Okay, so how do we solve this question? We said we have to use Green's function. And how do we use the Green's function? We said last week we introduced the Neumann-Green's function. It's really the Neumann's function. And you remember this was something like Laplacian G equals minus delta. No, there's a minus here, delta at point P. And then we said that the first derivative has to be equal to minus 1 divided by ds, or let's say d omega. So we have the domain, we have a singularity at point P. The normal derivative here is negative. It has to be equal to this, because you remember we said that if you integrate this, you integrate what is the integration of the delta Dirac over the domain. It's 1. Integration of Laplacian is exactly dg/dn. So this is a constant. So constant, if you integrate over the surface, it is what we have here. So d omega, 1 over d omega multiplied by d omega is exactly 1 with a minus. So it's exactly 1 equals 1. So this is the only possibility. And g here is defined up to a constant. Agree? Okay. Now we have to use, so there exists, the solution is defined up to a constant, and now we're going to use this with the Green's formula. Okay, so we are going to express, now we are going to go from a partial differential equation to the integral equation. So now we have to use what is called the Green's identity. Actually, I can go up. So Green's identity is Laplacian Ju minus G Laplacian U. If you integrate this over the domain omega, dV equals d omega u dj dn minus j du dn integrated over ds. Right, this is called Green's identity, and now we are going to substitute. This is a general identity. You should know how to prove this. This is basically the divergence theorem. Okay, so now we have to go slowly. What is Laplacian J? This is delta at point P. So this is with a minus. So this is minus U of P, right? Minus, so Laplacian U is equal to, so I am now starting from now, d equals 1. And we'll put it back later. We're going to carry all of this. Laplacian U equals minus 1. So minus and minus is plus, and then we have to integrate Green's function which is calculated at Q, and I call it P, which is to recall the singularity, dVP over the domain omega, equals, by definition, dj dn is minus, so we have minus d omega, that's going out, and we have to integrate u, let's call it u of q, dsq, integration d omega, and now du dn, by definition, this is 0 everywhere except on the small hole. So this is now minus the integral of d omega only on the absorbing part, minus p, no, q p, and du dn, calculated at which point? Point q, ds q. Can you see? What have we done? Just taking a PDE, transform it into an integral equation because of the Green's function. This is what the Green's function is telling us. How you convert PDE? Still, at this stage, what is u? We don't know. We just know that the value of u inside the domain is related to the value of this integral, the Green's function. This is actually a constant. You integrate whatever is u, and if u depends on epsilon, we can call this minus or plus, it's unimportant, but this is a constant that we call C epsilon. And this is something that's happened only at the boundary. You agree? Which is interesting now because the boundary is small, this is now where we are going to be able to say new things. But then,
sorry, this is absorption.
what?
But here the boundary is absorbed.
The absorption, that's right. But it's not u, it's udn. It's the flux. It's not u. It's udn, it's the flux. Yeah.
G is a Green's function or Newman's function?
J is what?
J is the Green's function.
J is the Neumann function.
Okay.
This is the solution of this equation. And we said last week that we gave an expansion. You remember when you have a point Q that is close to P, there was a singularity. Right? Okay, we will use that in a second. So this is an identity. So now, if you knew du dn, we then would be able to calculate this. This, where u is in this integral? There is no u. Where is epsilon in this integral? There is no epsilon. So this, when epsilon goes to 0, what is the limit of this term? When epsilon goes to 0, it's independent of epsilon, it stays the same, it doesn't change. So when epsilon goes to 0, u should go to, u is the mean first passage time, it should blow up to infinity. So this will never compensate something that goes to infinity. All right? So then we'll have this constant that has something that goes to infinity and has also something here that might go to infinity. So how do we get now information about du dn on the whole? Well, we'll get it from the equation itself. We need to have the conservation of the mass, which means, well, how do you get conservation? Let's integrate the equation, this equation, the first one. What does it give? So this is Laplacian u equal minus 1. Just rewrite it. Now let's integrate this equation. Integrate this equation over the entire volume. What is the integral of du dn? This is equal to du dn, integral of Laplacian u by the divergence theorem is equal to du dn. But du dn is 0 except on the small hole. ds, and this is equal to how much? What is the integral of 1 over the entire domain? This is equal to the volume. You agree? So that's good. Suppose you are a naive first-year student. And now we have this. What can you say about du dn? Let's make an assumption. Let's assume, you would like to, if you are able to extract du dn from here, then we can get some expression using this. And this is exactly what we are going to do. It's not completely correct what I'm going to say, but I'll still use this. Let me remind you what we're interested in. We're interested in the escape time. It's a fundamental masterpiece of this entire class. How long it takes for a brilliant particle to escape through here, right? How long it takes, and how can we calculate this? So we said that we use the Green's function, we use Green's identity, and we are here, and now we are going to try to solve it from here, because if we can get u of p, we're in business. This will count only for order 1. This is a constant, and this is something that we want to explore. Okay, so now since we have a small hole, you have a domain, you have a small hole, and let's suppose, now this is where you see that if it is a cusp, it's different. Let's suppose it is a regular boundary. Regular boundary that, it is the meaning in geometry. This is like a piece of R2, right? Half of R2, let's say you take a disk, and you cut it, and this is really just by a small deformation, you can have it into this. So this is really something small. So we are integrating, so let's call it, I don't know, we can put here an axe of symmetry, let's call it minus epsilon and epsilon. To make sure that it's the correct notation. No, let's call it epsilon divided by 2 and epsilon divided by 2, so that the total length is epsilon. Now suppose I'm going to assume now something that is incorrect, but I will do this assumption, it doesn't going to matter much. That du, suppose du dn, the flux, has a regular expansion. If it is a regular expansion, we can use what? We can use Taylor expansion. So Taylor expansion is at any point in this part here, we expand. So this is going to be a constant. Let's call it J0 of x, J0 plus J1 of x plus, and you do your Taylor expansion. Now if we plug this into this equation, integrating ds means integrating here over the length. So it's like integrating between minus epsilon divided by 2 epsilon divided by 2. Du dn, so we expand, so we can use the Taylor expansion, but it's really important. Because if you integrate with epsilon, you see that it's going to be epsilon squared, or even this one is going to cancel by symmetry, and you get something of epsilon cube. And this has to be equal to minus omega, which means that the leading order term, which is J0, so J0 multiplied by epsilon, plus other term that I do not care, has to be equal to this. Which means that the leading order term, J0, is minus omega divided by epsilon. So this is the first result that we get from here. And the leading order term of the flux, it goes to infinity with 1 over epsilon. All right, so this will give us this term. So now we need to use this equation, because basically now we have, although we have found this term, we will have another unknown, which is C epsilon. If you know this term and that term, when epsilon goes to infinity, if you don't care about this term, you will be given by the sum of the two. So now how do you get the information about the constant C epsilon? We're going to take u at which point? Now, what we haven't used here is the fact, where is the equation? Yeah, is the fact that we have used this, but we never used this. Now we're going to use this now. At P on the boundary, U of P has to be equal to 0. Now it's going to be exactly what we needed, because for P on this absorbing boundary, U of P equals 0. Then, at leading order in epsilon, this term will not matter, because this is 0, this stays whatever it is when epsilon goes to 0, which means that these two terms, they have to balance when epsilon goes to 0. So if we call it C epsilon, we have C epsilon plus or minus integration of d omega of the Green's function qp du dn ds. This has to be equal to 0. Can you see? And this is for p, so this is integration dq dsq. Now we need to calculate this. Now why this is interesting, and things can be done, because p and q now, p, this is in 0, so I call 0 here, sorry, p, it's in this absorbing part. So let's call the 0 of the domain, let's say the center. Now p, let's choose p exactly 0 here. Now q varies in this boundary. So p and q are actually very small. The distance between the two is very small. So, although the Green's function is something very complicated, the leading order term we know, because this is like in electrostatic. The leading order term in dimension 2 is log, And in dimension 3 is 1 over the distance, which blows up to infinity when P converges to Q. So what do we get? So let's do here dimension 2. Dimension 2 means Green's function, P and Q, equals, so you remember last week there was a factor 2 due to the image charge. There's going to be 1 minus pi log of the distance between P and Q, plus here a regular function which really I don't care. For the moment I don't care. Because when P converges to Q, this is regular, so this is finite. But this becomes infinite. And now we are going to put this into here and calculate this. And now, since we know what is du dn, which is the flux we just calculated, we're going to get C epsilon. All right? It took us some time to develop all the method. Okay, so now let's finish with this. So let's plug this into this equation. So the integral of the Green's function, which is, so let's call it minus and minus, this is plus 1 over pi. You integrate the same way as we did, it's minus epsilon divided by 2, integration over epsilon divided by 2, log of the distance. So now let's call it the distance, this is the arc length, we can put it log of s. du dn, so again here, what I'm saying is not correct because, okay, never mind, I'll tell you later. Du dn, I approximated it as this, minus omega divided by epsilon. This is minus omega divided by, if I make a mistake, you just tell me, right? So 1 over pi log of s ds. Yeah, and this is this, and so this has to be equal to minus C epsilon. All right, so now this is clearly just one integral. By symmetry, this is twice the integral from 0 to pi over 2 of log of s. And log of s, what is the integration of log of s? Is s log of s minus s, something like this, right? Between 0 and epsilon divided by 2. And then we have to multiply by minus omega divided by epsilon. So this is minus C epsilon. So now in 0, this is 0. So we are left with epsilon divided by 2. Multiply by 2, so we are left, the 2 goes away, divided by pi, minus omega. There's an epsilon and an epsilon. And then we have log of epsilon divided by 2. Finally, minus C epsilon, so C epsilon equals, to first order, I don't care about the log of 2, because log of, when epsilon goes to 0, right, log of epsilon divided by 2, this is log of epsilon minus log of 2, so which is log of epsilon, 1 minus log of 2 divided by log of epsilon. So this goes to 0 when epsilon goes to infinity, right? So I don't care about the fact that it's the log of 2. So I neglect it. So this is minus plus log of 1 over epsilon divided by pi. Do you agree? Yeah, it should be okay. All right. Are we done or not? We have now C epsilon. So if we go back to this equation, what have we found? So minus U epsilon of T plus this Green's plus this term, which is really of order 1, equals C epsilon minus Green's function of P and Q du dn ds d omega. let me have a minus sign somewhere now. No, this was minus C epsilon, no? Yeah. Okay, so now what happened if we take a point outside the boundary layer? If we take a point outside the boundary layer, which means the distance from P to Q is sufficiently long. You're not in this small neighborhood. The Green's function becomes of order 1. If the Green's function is of order 1, let's get it away outside the integral. This is something of order 1, a constant. I mean, not necessarily constant, but I do not care much what it is. So this is basically something that has to look like du dn over d omega a. So this, by definition, is equal to what? So I get this out. Du dn, this is what you just calculated to calculate the flux. This is exactly of the order of omega. So this is of order 1. All of this, when we're sufficiently far away, this is minus omega, which is really of order 1 compared to in epsilon, and epsilon is small. Which means that when you are far away from the absorbing hole, this is of order 1, and since the time goes to infinity, it should behave like u epsilon, and this is what we have. So u epsilon of p behave like omega divided by pi log of 1 over epsilon plus term of 1, which I haven't calculated here, which depends on the Green's function, the integral of the Green's function, other properties. And you can see that only in terms of order 1, you see the exit time, see where the particle started, not in the leading order term. The leading order term doesn't depend on the position as long as you start away from the boundary layer. Okay, so this is what we have in dimension 2, the mean first passage time for a small hole that is accessible. It's not a cut, there is no singularity. It's log of 1 over epsilon plus O of 1. Okay. And so I'm not going to work here, it's much harder to look at what is phi of x. Phi of x is something complicated that this is, you can take this entire function, which is true, and you try to make an expansion for this of u of p when p is a small neighborhood. And then the Green's functions start to contribute, so you cannot neglect as I did here. So you have to go and see how it depends on epsilon. But what is for sure, because it's a first order partial differential equation, du dn is not 0, and du dn, this exactly gives you the flux. Now I cheat a little bit, is that u, the flux, is actually not a smooth function, it has singularities. But in dimension 2, the singularity is not very drastic. So this is now one remark. So in principle, and this is known, the flux through a small hole in dimension 2, in dimension 3, in fact, I'll give you the expression in 1 second again for the dimension 3, the flux. So remark, the flux is singular, but it has a smooth, I mean, it's a gentle singularity. Actually, du dn is of the order of constant divided by 1 minus, or let's say epsilon square minus r squared divided by r squared. So there is a singularity when you go to the 0 minus epsilon divided by 2, so it usually does something like this. So I have approximated by a constant, but if you just use this in the expansion, and you expand around, approximate by r, by r equals 0, you don't care about this variation here. Because you're in dimension 1 over square root is integrable and it doesn't matter much. Dimension 3, it's a bit more drastic because it contributes much more, because in dimension 3 this occurs along a disk, meaning along if you have a disk as a small hole, it occurs along the length of the disk. Okay, so before we go to dimension 3, let me ask you a question. All right, everybody wrote it's okay? I can continue? Okay. So now let's discuss what happens if you have two holes. If you have n holes. So now questions. What is the mean first passage time? If you have a domain and you can have n holes. Let's say we start with 2. What is the mean first passage time to exit? You start from x when you have 2 holes. There are 2 holes. Is it the same as the mean first passage time with 1 hole? So, what is the intuition? And then once we understand the intuition, we can write the equation and we will see how to solve. All right, we discussed the mean first passage time with 1 hole. We found an expression for it, right? Because here, this is the mean first passage time for 1 hole. Now, if you have 2 holes, what do you expect? So, if you start, let's suppose you have 2 identical holes with the same length epsilon. How long it takes for a particle to escape? Well, the intuition is to say that if you have 2 holes, the time would be the time divided by 2. The time we found for 1 hole divided by 2. This is true as long as the 2 holes are well separated. So what happened now is the 2 holes start to become closer and closer and closer again. So let's look at the magic of this. This is the time for 1 hole, which is pi divided by omega, surface divided by pi log of 1 over epsilon. This is for 1 hole. Now we said that for 2 holes, the time for 2 holes should be when they are well separated, the time for 1 hole divided by 2. I haven't proved this yet. Now, if 1 hole is moving to the direction of the other one, what happens when it becomes tangent? So they are really like forming a single hole because they are really the 2 together. So what is the size now of this hole? Is twice the size of 1 hole. And now we just calculated it. And we said that the size, the time for a hole of size 2 epsilon is going to be omega divided by pi log of 1 divided by 2 epsilon. But now log of 1/2. This is nothing compared to log of epsilon, because this can be also written, you can write this log of 1/2 plus log of 1 of this, correct? When epsilon is very small, you don't care. So when the 2 holes are very close together, the time is the same as the time for 1 hole. So in general, when you have 2 holes, depending on when they are, you can have a factor 2. If they are very close together, it's almost, of course there is a correction, there is something, it's almost the time for 1 hole. And if you start to move them apart, it starts to be divided by 2. And why we were interested into this? Because in bacteria, you have exactly receptors on the surface, and sometimes, under some condition, the receptors start to cluster, and sometimes they can get uniform. Now you can ask, how does that affect the flux? How, because, okay, what is a, let me back up 1 second. You have a, whatever your cell, how it senses its environment. I'm not talking about the eye where you have photons that come directly, but usually, like a sperm, a cell in the environment, they sense what you have outside because they have small receptors. And small receptors, let's approximate them as just absorbing. That is, a molecule arrives, it is absorbed. It's not fully absorbed because usually it binds and there is some kind of pathway that then leads to some signaling, but basically you have this. So you sense your environment because some proteins arrives. Most of the time they are just reflected. But then you can change the flux here by looking at by having different kind of configuration. You can imagine two extreme configurations, all are clustered, compared to the case where they are all, let's say, uniformly distributed. Now the question, how much you sample, what's the difference between the two? And it has been observed in some bacteria that this is exactly what happened. Under some high concentration of whatever cues or chemoattractants, you have the receptors that are sometimes uniformly distributed, and in the other extreme, they can get forming a single cluster, or they are clustering. So, then this is a way to modulate the flux by changing the position of your absorber. So we wrote some papers about almost 10 years ago, 2006, 2007, yeah, 9 years ago, on this. And now how do you prove this? The method should be exactly what we have done. What is the difference? So let me erase this. How do you prove all of this? So it's clear to understand what I said in dimension 2. In dimension 3, it's more subtle. Why? Because in dimension 2, having two holes and then bringing them together has the same geometry. That is, they are together, it's one hole with double size. Now, what is the equivalent? Now you have suppose you're in dimension 3, you have a disk, and now the disk coming together. There is no like shape for two disks. What is the equivalent shape? Is it a disk of size r with a certain factor? The answer is no. There is no such equivalent. Why? Because the mean first passage time sees the shape of the hole. Not in dimension 2, because it's too simple, but starting in dimension 3. What does it mean it sees the shape? Okay, let me explain this because I think it's important before we continue. I haven't discussed yet dimension 3, but the mean first passage time in dimension 3, if you have an elliptic hole, it does depend on the elliptic integral of the characteristic of the ellipse. Something like KE divided by A. So if you have, you have an ellipse is characterized by two axes, A and B, and so K of E, something like integral of 0 divided by pi over 2, this theta, something like 1 minus, so if A is the biggest, something like this, A divided by B divided by one of them, cosine or sine, maybe it's important, something like this. So it does see the shape. You don't have here something that, you have here something that depends on the fact that you have an ellipse. And the matter of fact is that actually an open question is what is the escape in dimension 3 for a general shape window? Nobody knows. We try very hard, a square or a rectangle, very hard. And we found a new type of flux. Why it's hard? It's hard because you have singularities here. And at the corner, the same that in here in dimension 2, you see, there is a profile of the flux. At the corner, at the singularity, here you get a lot from the corner. So if you neglect them, you're screwed up. And it's very hard to calculate the flux at a corner. Singularity, especially in dimension 3, you don't have conformal mapping. It's tough. Okay, it's not an easy question to understand in dimension 3 when you have receptors. What is the equivalent receptors? What are the equivalent shape? There is none. So it's much harder to compare with the dimension 2 case. Okay, so I'll give you this equation, and then we'll be ready for a break. So how do you now solve? Now suppose this is the exam time, except that it's going to last 15 seconds. How do you solve this question? How do you? I gave you all the methodology. How do you now solve the mean first passage time for 2 holes? Answer. 5 more seconds. The answer is, let's use what we have done, except that now we are going to write this equation. Instead of having this at 1 hole, we'll have it at 2 holes, and that's it. And now we're going to have, so let's write it, right? So now instead of having, this stay completely valid. Now I'm just writing this. How do you write this? This now is going to be written with 2 terms because we have 2 holes. So this is hole number 1. So this doesn't change, doesn't change, doesn't change. This change. So this is hole number 1. Let's call it omega 1. JQP du dn minus integral of dA2 Green's function du dn, the same thing. Now we are going to have before we had 2 unknown, there was du dn and the constant c. Now we have an additional unknown. There are 2 fluxes and c. So there are how many unknowns? There are 3. 1 flux at 1 hole, 1 flux at the other hole, and c. Last time we had 2 equations. Now we need 3 equations. So where the equations are coming from? Now if we integrate du dn, so we had Laplacian u equal -1. So we integrate this again. So this is Laplacian. So I integrate this, you integrate this. This is equal to minus the volume. And now if we integrate du dn over the absorbing part, now it's divided into 2. There are 2 holes, so this is du dn d omega 1 plus du dn d omega 2, which has to be equal to minus omega. So now we have 1 equation here, and now we need 2 more. Where are the 2 equations are coming from? We are going to take u at a point P, where P belongs to 1 hole, and then to the other one. And this will give us, through the Green's function, the correlation. So the correlation is going to be hidden in the Green's function interaction. Okay, let me write this. I write the equation, and then we can break. So take u, P, for a point P, for hole number 1. Let's call it 1. This is equal to, by definition, u is equal to 0. This, we say we don't care, because this is of order 1. This is a constant, and now we'll get this. So for this we get minus c epsilon equals 0. 0 equals minus c epsilon minus, so now we are integrating for P A1. So let's call this point P1. So let's call it Q P1 integrated over whole 1 du dn minus d omega 2. We have to integrate Q for whole number, let's call it P the same, P1. And now this is dp du dn. And now this is ds p, the dsq. And this is dsq. Right? So this is, we wrote it once. Now let's take a point P for the whole d omega 2, and let's call this point P2. So this is P1, this is P2, so this is 0 minus C epsilon minus Green's function Q P2 at whole d omega A1 du dn ds minus Green's function at point Q P whatever, P no P2 du dn dsq. Right? Now we have one equation, two equation, three equation. What are the unknowns? So let's call the unknown the flux du dn at whole number 1, let's call it C1, du dn at whole number 2, A2, let's call it C2. So we have C1, C2, C epsilon, we have three unknown, three equations. We are good. And now this is elementary matrix equation. Why? Because, all right, so let's just discuss the equation. I'm not sure I want to solve them now, but it's possible. I mean, the same way we did. But just to show you what we have. And this is the interesting part, because all the geometry we have discussed is contained in the Green's function. This is whole number 1, this is whole number 2, and they are small. So what is this term here? This is Green's function at point P1 for Q in this hole. So you vary in here. So this has a singularity. Now this is now Q varying 2, and P is in 1, and it varies really in a small position. So this is almost constant. Doesn't vary much, this distance, which is the distance here. So the Green's function here, as you remember, was written, it depends on the distance between P and Q. So here this is a dependency on the distance. If you're far away, and if J is about constant, because this distance doesn't vary much, we can take it out, because it's a constant. And then you have to integrate the flux. And now this is completely symmetric. So I don't have to discuss this, this is the same. So now you just can take it out, and you end up with a system of three equations, three unknown, and you solve. And you get the mean first passage time. The mean first passage time is C epsilon. If you're interested, this was published with myself and Shoes. This is, I think, 2007 in Phys letter 8, almost 10 years. And then we have a long paper, the same in Journal Physical A. I think it was 2008, because it takes usually more time to be published in that journal than in that journal. That's the reason. This is important again, because of this notion that you can regulate fluxes by positioning. I can tell you one more thing, that, for example, today what we are looking at is that suppose you have a source here, and you have some receptors. Can you find where the source is located? If you can just calculate, or you are just able, you sit on here, you ask your wife or whoever you want to sit on this one, and you sit on the other one. And if you have children, they can also sit over there, and they count. And at each moment of time, you are at home, and you ask how many particles you get. how many particles you get here, how many particles you get here, how many particles you get there. Can you, from this, tell me, all right, we have to move, here is the target, it is there with a given distance. It's not, it hasn't been solved, although this is really what should have been solved when people talk about chemotaxi. Because this is not about how many molecules are fluctuating at this place. This is the ability of the cell to know where is the source. And this is much harder actually than what I showed to you. But because it involves Green's function for outer domain, not inner domain. All right, so it does matter the number of receptors and where they are located. We'll break now. I'll explain when I'm coming back, when we come back, dimension 3. I leave this, so if you're interested, you know, we did this calculation in these papers with many holes. What Michael Ward, my collaborator and competitor, I have to say my friend, has done something a little bit better than us. He has calculated the expansion, the full expansion. So he has, because he's using this match asymptotic, he could get not only the leading order term here, but the next term. And this is interesting, because then you can see how the position in the mean-first passage time, you see basically why in dimension, if you do the mean-first passage time here, why you cannot reconstruct. Because this term is occluded by that one. But not outer space, because the outer space, the mean-first passage time is infinite. So this is the what he has done, and it's a completely set of papers that are also very interesting with a different method. Okay, so let's break, and when we'll come back, we'll discuss the bit dimension 3, and then I want to show you the completely new type of asymptotics of partial differential equation, which are based on conformal mapping to solve the exit problem in cusp, when you have cusp, singularities. 10 minutes break. Because I think, yeah, we did, but never published. So narrow escape in dimension 3. I'll give the main step and the result, and then we move on to diastrate. Diastrate is the title we have invented to describe the escape from very narrow passages. Okay, narrow escape in dimension 3. So basically, the formula that I gave you, which is still on the board, which is this one, doesn't depend on the dimension, because this is generally true. So now, so in dimension 3, so this stays, so we have this. So the identity relation remains. So I don't have to prove it or rederive it. Second, we still have that the integration of Laplacian u equals -1 or minus omega, which means that integration of the d omega absorption mu dn equals minus volume. So this is also an identity. Okay, so there are some differences. There are some differences. So now, okay, I've changed a little bit the Green's function, but it's unimportant. The Green's function I'm going to use is a bit different, but okay. So now I'll call the flux du dn, and now there is a singularity that you can, so there's singularity for x. So x is the flux. So the flux, what is the flux? The flux is lives on the boundary. This is the number of particles per unit of time that are going through a point x. And now if you're in dimension 3, I have to, let's say, assume that the absorbing part is a ball of radius, this is, let's say, a disk of radius epsilon. So you have a disk here of radius epsilon. And so, for example, this is your domain. And now the shape of this is a constant divided by, so epsilon squared minus r squared square root, where r here, if we take a local coordinate system of coordinate, this is really the geodesic distance. If you are on a, let's say, on your surface, geodesic distance to to zero, to the center of the disk. R is the distance of 0 to a point P. Right, so if you imagine that this is a ball, then this is your cap, and R is this distance here between 0 point P. Right, so this is what is R here. So this is really the flux on this absorbing window. So now, what is the Green's function? So to calculate this, we need the Green's function, we need the flux. So the flux I just gave you, just give you the flux. And now the Green's function can be written for 2 points, x and y, which is, or let's say P and Q, on this, on the absorbing part. So this is 1 divided by 2 pi, because of the image charge, of P minus Q plus the regular part, which I don't care. All right, so now, if we take a point P that belongs to if we take a point P that belongs to this absorbing hole, the same as we did in dimension 2, this is 0. This can be shown to be regular, so there is no singularity here. And we have again this integral equation, which is C epsilon or minus C epsilon equals, so now if you are on this absorbing window, this can be written 1 divided by P minus Q du dn ds over, let's say, the cap, which I'll approximate like a 2-dimensional disk of size epsilon. Okay. So now, there are 2 equations. I mean, how many unknown we have? There is du dn, and in du dn there is a constant c. Let's call it c tilde. C tilde is unknown, and c epsilon is unknown. So we have 2 constants. So we have one equation here, which is called an integral equation. And we have a second equation here. So there is 2 equations to solve. So this is not very hard to see what is c epsilon in terms of this. So how do you calculate? This is the integral over, you integrate from 0 to epsilon. Now we have to integrate in a cap, so this is 2 pi. So everything is symmetric with respect to r. So this is 2 pi r dr, constant c tilde, divided by this, which is epsilon square minus r squared. And I don't care about terms of order 2. If you're in a manifold, you can be some distortion, I don't care. So I assume this is like everything is on the plane. At leading order, this is what we get. And this has to be equal to this. So this gives us whatever, if you know how to integrate or not, it gives us a relation between C tilde and this. We can calculate it, right?
What is C tilde?
C tilde is a constant.
Okay.
This is this C tilde here. This is a constant, I don't know what it is.
It's a constant you fixed, or
It's going to be fixed here. I mean, this I didn't tell you where it comes from. It comes from the Weber 1874 calculation of the electrified disk problem. If you have a disk with some charges, you ask what is the voltage at a given position. So they have calculated that the flux or the distribution of charges, and this is equivalent because this is really Laplacian equation, and you have Laplacian equation in electrostatic. In electrostatic, you have to solve Laplacian V equals minus rho, and rho is the density. So if you have, and here you solve it in half the space where an electrified disk is located. So this is the form of the flux, which I have assumed. And for example, this is done in Conk, 1975, the book about diffusion. Okay, so who can integrate this? I think we can, right? So this is if we differentiate this, square root, there is 1/2, and there is a 2, so it goes away. So this is like 2 pi C tilde, right? So this should be correct. So between 0 and epsilon, so at epsilon, and there should be a minus somewhere. No? Oh yeah, it should be a minus. So at epsilon, this is 0, and for r equals 0, this is epsilon. So what do we get? What do we get from here? We get minus omega equals pi epsilon, and there's a factor 2, and there is a C tilde. Should be something like this if I haven't made any mistake. Epsilon C tilde minus 2 pi. Epsilon minus and minus is plus, so this should be correct. Okay. And now, let's put that into here. Let's fix, let's say, one of the P or Q, let's say P, the center here. And so this is exactly the distance. So this is now the integral from 0 to epsilon. This is now we integrate over the ball, which is 2 pi r dr. Now this is 1 over r, because this is the distance. Then this is square root of what? This is square root of epsilon squared minus r squared. Am I correct? No. And I forgot the C tilde. Yeah? So what is this integral? R and R goes away. And now how do you integrate this? So if we write R equals epsilon u, this integral from 0 to 1, C tilde 2 pi du divided by 1 minus u squared. So what is this 2 pi? This is arc sine, no? Arc cosine. What is the integral of this? Yes, if you just write cosine or sine u. Yeah, so this is arc sine of 1. What is arc sine of 1? What is the sine that gives 1? What is the sine? It's pi over 2. Okay. Pi over 2. Wait, there is something wrong here. Yeah, because this is incorrect. I'm sorry. Yeah, I forgot here the 2 pi. So I have to divide this because this comes from here, I have to divide here by 2 pi. So if I divide by 2 pi, the 2 pi goes away. Pi goes away and half pi divided by 2. All right. And where are we with all of this? What is the mean first passage time? Yeah, so now I have to plug C tilde by what it is. And then we're done, because minus C epsilon is what we want. And that's it. I mean, this first, the leading order term. So minus, what is minus C epsilon? It's pi over 2 multiplied by C tilde, and C tilde is what? Is minus omega divided by 2 pi epsilon. Pi and pi goes, so this is omega divided by 4 epsilon. So the mean first passage time in dimension 3, the leading order term, is omega divided by 4 epsilon. If there is a diffusion coefficient which is less than different than 1, you have here to divide by d. Okay, so now the interesting things are coming now, but I'm not going to do this. I'll just give you the results. So this is the philosophy. Now I'm going to give you some remark, and then we'll finish with this. And then we can go to the last part. So I'll give you a remark, is that now we can do an asymptotic expansion. So there is an asymptotic expansion that is done in, I think this is Zinger and Zev and myself. And I think this is 2007 Phys Rev E. And so the expansion is tau epsilon equals omega divided by 4a. Now instead of, I call a here the size of the disk where the particle can escape. And it's not necessarily a disk, not a ball, it can be any three-dimensional shape. And this is 1 plus the mean curvature at 0, which is the center here of the ball, divided by 2 pi a log a plus a term of order 1. So I'm not proving this, it's much longer.
Sorry, A here is?
A is the size, A is the radius. That is, you have a domain, now you have a ball of radius A, and this is telling you how long it takes to escape, and more important, it's telling you that the term here, the next order term, is in log of 1 over epsilon. That is, so we have to do the calculation, but it's O of 1, log of 1 over epsilon, plus, I mean, let's call it constant, which can be found here, you know, you just expand, so A, log of A is going to 0. So 1 divided by 1 plus something going to 0 is 1 minus. So actually this is 1 minus this, and A cancels, and you have something in 1 over log. So this is an important term because it's not in this power, it's 1 over epsilon, and then it becomes a term of order 1, where you see the position where the particles start, which I'm not describing. Okay, so if you want to see where the particles start, you have to go to the third order term, number 1, number 2, number 3, which is quite demanding. But so this has been calculated for when you escape from a ball. This has been calculated by Michael Ward. This is the work that he did in he had a series of papers in 2010 in Science, Multiscale Modeling and Simulation. You just look at Michael Ward and you will find this. All right? Okay. Now we have 20 minutes to do diastrate. Questions? I mean, again, this is, I'm going through 10 years of work very quickly. It takes time to understand. The methods are difficult, not easy. Although it looks simple when I present it to you, if you want to go into the detail, it's a little bit more involved. I'm not showing you how you calculate this. It has to do with looking at the next term in the expansion of the Green's function, which was found in 1990 by Russians. Popov found this, and this was used to calculate, to do this expansion. Okay, and what I haven't shown you here, but this can be done when you have an elliptic. Why you can calculate how this term is different from if you have an elliptic hole, because here, instead of having this, you have to calculate this flux along an ellipse. And this is where you get this elliptic integral. I'm not doing it in here. But what is the consequence for this is that the mean first passage time, if you think about probability, the particle, the Brownian particle, sees the shape. It's going to be in the leading order term of the time it takes to escape. And the time it takes to escape, it's also if you do an experiment in your lab, this is the rate at which particles arrive to a small hole. If you're in dimension 3, this is exactly the rate, and usually it's an exponential rate. Okay. It's a lot for today. Most of this is in the book. It's I brought the book. So this is about the 61st pages of the book that we wrote with Dev. We have all of these descriptions. For example, when you calculate the time to escape through two holes, we also calculated the splitting. What is the probability that the particle will hit one hole before the other? All right, so we are now ready for diastrate. Okay, so the last part of the class of today is called the diastrate time. So I already discussed it at the beginning. This is the time it takes to escape through narrow passages. So we ask the following question. Suppose you have an ensemble of obstacles and they are big enough, and you look at the domain defined here by the 4 disk. And those obstacles, they are impenetrable. Nothing can enter into this obstacles. And you start with a Brownian particle. And now you ask how long it takes to escape, to find one of the 4 ends that are there. Right? How long it takes to escape. And this is a model to cause grain diffusion on the membrane of a cell, like a neuronal cell. Because diffusion, what do you see under the microscope? Under the microscope, you might see this due to the coarse grain resolution of the microscope. So you see this, and what your algorithm is doing, if you have, is going to connect the dots, and this is going to be your trajectory. Now this has nothing to do with the, I mean, you can ask, what is the connection between what you are seeing and the reality? For this, you need a model, because you don't see the obstacles. However, you know that at a very short scale, you have the Brownian motion, which is given by a certain diffusion coefficient. And if you wait sufficiently long enough, which is the time it takes to escape from this, that's what I'm going to calculate, you get a coarse grain motion, which is a jump process to the neighbors. It can only escape in the full one, assuming that they are organized in a square lattice. And so then you have a jump process. So you have this square. So you have an ensemble of square. And now what we are really doing here is a coarse graining. We coarse grain the motion as a jump process between the different squares, which is what you get from your experiments if you are taking a delta t, a time for sampling, which is long enough. And then you are back to a certain diffusion process, but now you are interested in asking how this diffusion, effective diffusion, depends on the density of obstacles, and especially these passages. Because if it is very narrow, then the time is going to be very long between all those jumps. And if it is like this, you can show that you can recourse grain everything as a continuous diffusion process with an effective diffusion coefficient that we can calculate from the escape time to this particular region. That was the motivation when we started all of this about 6-7 years ago. And why we did this? Because escaping from a cusp is not as simple as escaping from a regular part, as we're going to see now. And so as a generic question for this, we said, now look at this. Suppose you have a domain with a cusp. So the generic domain is going to be this one. Take two disks. This is the x-axis. This is the y-axis. And let's take our domain, which is following exactly the cusp, and then it can be here big domain, whatever it is. We don't care. And now we ask the question, how long it takes to escape this domain, which means that you start at position x here. You have again Brownian motion, and you want to know how long it will take to hit for the first time the blue arc of length epsilon. Right? This is the question. Now, how do you solve this? We have already formulated the problem 3 times. Now we have to solve the PDE with a cusp. Now this becomes non-trivial. So it took us a couple of years to see that how we are going to address this question. I mean, again, we are not interested in showing that it goes to infinity. It's clear that it's going to infinity. So now we have 2 new parameters. I mean, an additional new parameter, which is the radius of curvature, r. R is the radius of curvature of this that's approximating here your funnel. The curvature radius. Okay? And now we need, so again, I take diffusion coefficient equals 1. So we are left with the equation of person equal -1, u equals 0 on the arc, let's call it absorbing, and then du dn equals 0 on the reflecting part. And so, how we solve this question? So what is the Green's function with a cusp? We don't know. So in some sense, you need to find out a way to get rid of the singularity in the domain and to put it in the equation. So now we started in dimension 2. Dimension 3, it's also possible if you have enough symmetry. So how do you do this? What we did is basically, I'll give you the idea before we start. What is the boundary layer? Boundary layer is the place where basically the time depends on the position. The boundary layer is exactly in this funnel. While if you start, this is called the boundary layer. That is really, you can see the dependency of the position. While if you start anywhere here, basically it doesn't matter where you started. And so the idea is that there is a very specific new type of boundary layer analysis here, because how are we going to resolve this? So the idea was to stretch the boundary layer, and this region is an important. So for this, we use what is called Mobius conformal mapping transformation, which is a transformation which is well known in complex variable, which is z minus alpha divided by minus alpha z, where alpha, I will explain in a second, which is a real parameter. I will explain in a second what it is. Why using this? So this is now, let's say, a ball of radius 1. And z is, so this is x and y. So z is x plus iy. So, yeah, and it is shifted. So, so I'm sorry, this is the y. This is the y for this transformation. So this is a disk center at 0. Now the idea of the Mobius transformation is whatever is outside goes inside. And now I'm not going to show it, to show the detail, but now if you have a complex variable, you can ask where this little arc is going to be mapped. So you have a conformal mapping, right, that will map this somewhere. And this, all of this length here somewhere. So this will tell us where all of this domain is going to be mapped. So again, you can do it, or you can do it in MATLAB, or just by, so for example, what is the image of something real by a complex function that is where alpha is real? This by definition is going to be real again. Yeah, because if it's real, everything is real. So I'm telling you that now this is going to be, so this point here, -1, is actually an invariant point. So actually, this is going to be mapped here. This part here is going to be mapped, because it's on the circle, what is in the circle stay in the circle, right? You know how to, you understand what I'm saying, or this is completely different language? So for example, if you take the z equals I theta, this is the, so if you plug that into here, so let's show that this is on the circle. How do you show this? We have to prove that the modulus is 1. So how do you do this? This is I theta minus alpha divided by 1 minus alpha multiplied by I theta, correct? But this now you can just divide. This is also I theta minus alpha divided by 1 minus alpha. And now I put the I minus I theta, and now I have to put here I theta, correct? I didn't change anything. Now this is absolute value, so this is 1. This divided by this is 1, so this is 1. So what is on the disk is sent on something that is on the disk. On the surface. You're with me? This is elementary, right? I just take this, a point z, which is on this disk of radius 1, And this function, which is phi of I theta, absolute value which is equal to this, which is equal to this, it's equal to 1. This is on the disk. Okay. So this, which is on the disk, will stay on the disk, but not at this position. It is inverted, so it will go to here. And then you can continue, and this at some point will go like this. And then when you end up in here, this that was mapped in here, you have to continue through this, so you have something parallel. And this is mapped into this domain. So the entire domain here is mapped on a domain, and the size of this, if this is of size epsilon, this is of size epsilon, or 2 epsilon, I always forget. This is the size of this domain. Do you want me to enlarge a little bit so that we see? Again, it took us some time to do all this mapping. So the domain is mapped into this. And this is of size square root epsilon. Now this is great. Why it's great? Because when epsilon goes to 0, the domain converges to something which is like a line, which is like dimension 1. Although we started with full dimension 2, it's not becoming dimension 1. So that's the idea behind this calculation. Now, how do we do the rest? The rest is not very hard. So again, I'll give you references for this. We have this, and now it's very easy to continue. We just make a change of variable, and to transport the equation u, that was the u of z, into an equation of v of w in this domain, which is the domain in the complex plane of w. W, which is phi of z. So we have u of z, which is v of w. So now we have to write the equation for v. And so the equation for v is usually, so this is a classical conformal mapping that you plug into the Laplacian. This will give you phi prime of v squared, Laplacian of v of w, that is should be equal to -1, right? So this is, again, just take Laplacian u of v and you have to compose it, so you have the second derivative that comes. So this is a classical formula. And now we need to calculate phi prime of z, so we need to differentiate this with respect to z. Okay, so you can do the calculation, it's trivial, I just did it before. Coming, phi prime of z is equal to 1 minus alpha squared divided by 1 minus alpha z squared. And now we need to express everything in w, because we need to be everything. So then we need to invert this w equals z minus this, so we need to express z as a function of w, put that in here, and the result is 1 plus alpha omega divided by 1 minus alpha squared. And now we need to put this squared. And now we have an equation in this domain, which is Laplacian v. So I'll give you the result. Okay, there is one more thing I have to tell you. To be able to do this, the alpha has to be very precise. And alpha is actually a perturbation of epsilon. This is 1 minus square root of epsilon. And so when you have this, you have to write another equation, which is this one. So I divide this by this factor that I've calculated here. And so you ended up with minus 4 epsilon divided by, so d equals 1, omega 1 minus square root epsilon minus 1 to the power 4. and V, this is sent to this, so V of 0, V equals 0, V equals 0 on this part here, this on the image, let's call it phi of the omega A, and otherwise dVdn equals 0. This is the reflecting boundary condition. Now what have we done? And omega here, this is the omega, which is a complex variable in this plan. This is the variable omega. Let's call omega, for example, capital X plus Iy. This is X and this is Y. I wanted to finish today, but I'm not going to finish. Okay, so now, what have we win? Why we did all of this? Why? For one reason. Now, the boundary layer is all of this, but this is almost one-dimensional. So if it is almost one-dimensional, let's be brutal. This is in the variable x and y. This is really a partial differential equation. When epsilon is very small, this is very narrow. This is almost a partial differential equation on one line with some curvature. So this, how do you write Laplacian in polar coordinate? This is ddv dr squared plus 1 over r ddv dr plus 1 over r squared ddv d theta. But if v as a function of r, the variation, the change in r, is negligible, we're just going to assume that at first order it is a function just of theta. And this x plus y can be written r and theta, which is the notation I have used for this. So this is for r almost equal 1. And theta will be the only variable. So if it's independent of r, this is 0, this is 0, and r is almost 1. So we are left with the second order equation in theta, which is trivial to integrate because we have this in here equal this. So this is 1 minus epsilon. Omega is what? Is going to be I theta because r is about 1. 1 minus square root epsilon minus 1 to the power 4. Now you can integrate this. Once you understand correct transformation, the problem is not hard. How do you integrate this? You integrate it once. So we're going to integrate it. This is dv d theta. Let's integrate it from the position theta, position phi, to the end. Okay, now we have to understand what is the end. What is this angle here? Because now we integrate in the angle. So this is the end angle. So this is basically somewhere like capturing the end. So for this, it turned out that this angle, and this we have to do some calculation for this. This angle is of the order a constant square root epsilon. This is the maximum angle that you can go. Theta max. And so this is, so we integrate this. And the idea, of course, is at this point, since the particle is reflected, so this is dv this theta minus dv this theta at c square root epsilon equals theta c square root epsilon of this, which is minus 4 epsilon exponential I u 1 minus square root epsilon minus 1 power 4 du. Now what is this equal to? This, what happened, a particle at this point here, all particles are reflected. So the mean first passage time, the derivative of the mean first passage time should be 0. And now we have to integrate one more time to get v as a function of theta. Now we know by definition that when a particle hits this part here, which is equivalent to this one, it is absorbed. So v theta minus v0, and this is by definition 0. This is the integration from 0 to theta of c square root epsilon to, let's say, phi minus 4 epsilon d u exponential I u 1 minus square root epsilon minus 1 to power 4 du d phi. And this is 0. So this is the solution. Okay, so now we need to calculate what? What do we need to calculate? We need to calculate the mean first passage time when the particles start anywhere here, because we say it is constant. And this part here is exactly this part here. So this is sent to here. And this we have to take for theta. Let's say something in this of this order. So now we need to calculate and then we start. So we need to calculate, so next week we'll calculate v of c square root epsilon, which is the integral from 0 to c square root epsilon. So with the minus, if I didn't make a mistake, let's rotate, so this is now integral from phi to c square root epsilon of epsilon du d phi exponential I u 1 minus square root epsilon minus 1. It's calculations. But mathematics is about calculations, nothing else. And how to do them and how to do them right. If it's impossible, we can simulate. This is trivial now. Once we understood the ideas of this conformal mapping and the fact that how you choose alpha, and understand that the domain now can be reduced to dimension 1, so you can now integrate. And there are succession of ideas that allows us to calculate. And this idea works in dimension 3 when we have symmetries, but it's a bit more complicated. Okay, to finish, there is more calculations. Maybe we'll finish next week. If you are interested, the way to do the calculation now, we need to change the order of integration. I'm not going to do it, it's very easy, you just look at when phi is going, when u is going from phi to this, you have to see what u is doing. So I'll give you the results. So this is 4 epsilon d, so this is, call it v of c square root epsilon. This is c square root epsilon pi. And this is pi minus eta divided by exponential I eta minus 1 minus I eta square root epsilon to power 4. Now, we are done if we know how to calculate this integral. Now, where is the problem? The problem is c. C is something that we don't know what it is. At the constant, this is the order of magnitude at which we have this angle. So we need to connect, as we did before. You remember there was this notion of compatibility condition, which came by integrating the equation. And this is the same, integrating the equation, we have Laplacian u equal -1, you remember? And we did it at least 3 or 4 times. We integrated this. And this gave du dn equals minus omega. You remember? We did, this is the same here. Now du dn over this, if du dn is almost constant, as we said before, we get du dn multiplied by the length of this is about, let's say, epsilon, equals minus omega. So basically there is some information here, and now we have to connect this calculation, which is done in this plane, to the derivative of the normal derivative in that plane, which is not too hard because we have exactly the connection. The connection is written somewhere. Yeah, here. U of z equals this, so if you differentiate u with respect to a variable, we have to see this is dv with respect to this variable, which is dv d omega, this variable, just combine. And this will allow to get c. So I want to stop now because I want to discuss and then I have to go. But I'll give you the results and we will finalize it next week, all right? Here is the result that you have to think for tonight and the night after. Okay, the final results. So next week we are going to calculate this integral by cutting into 2 because you have pi here and minus, so we're going to cut into 2 and see what happens when epsilon goes to 0, to the limit. And c depends on the constant c that we will connect. But the result is the following. The mean first passage time in dimension 2 is pi omega divided by d. And if we have the curvature radius, this is square root of r, and we have square root of epsilon. R is the curvature, omega is the volume of the entire. Epsilon here, this is the size of the opening. This is a leading order term. Mean first passage time in dimension 2 in a cusp is not anymore log. It's 1 over square root epsilon. It's much longer if you want to escape through a cusp. I'll finish with an open problem. What happened here if it's not a cusp of order 2? Order 2 means approximated by a disk, but let's say of order 3, like the local expansion is y instead of being a x squared. Now suppose this is x cubed or any power. How does that change? We don't know. We did it on the surface in dimension 2, but not here, because the fact that you map conformally the disk is very important to maintain the structure. Otherwise, there is all kind of problem inside. I can give 20 euros for this question. I think a little bit more. I can give about 200 euros because we don't know how to solve it. Okay, next week we'll work on this. And if you have a free weekend, you can think about solving this for a general cusp. Right, next week I will prove this. And that will end our mathematical part of the class. And next week we will go, except for this, to more application to biology, super resolution data analysis, deconvolution, model of aggregation with finite number of particles, and so on.